Okay, at this point, I can assume that if you've stumbled upon this, you probably know what it is, but in case somebody wanders here, these are videos I'm making for my mother to read the books that I have written. They are not published works as of yet. If you happen to be or know someone in the publishing field and want to help a girl out, have them contact me, but otherwise, feel free to enjoy my books. Thank you. Bones of Stone by Elaine Allen. Chapter 1. Rissa paused on the top of the wall, staring out over the dark salvage yard. The area closest to her was piled with shattered stone, marble tiles, statues, and blocks broken into pieces too small to be easily reused. Wood, broken hulls of ships, ruined furniture, boards that started rotting before they could be used, was stacked just beyond. Rissa could just see the dorms, built from a combination of the two types of junk and divided by fences to keep the three teams apart. Past the dorms, there was another fence, this one far sturdier, surrounding the metal scrap. The teams were only allowed in there one at a time, under careful supervision, to sort, melt down, or pack the metal to be sold off to smiths. Just beyond the fence, Rissa could see the guards' dorms, almost twice the size of the slave dorms, to house 6 men, or 4 at the moment. 2 of the guards would be on duty at the gate or making the rounds to ensure none of the slaves were where they weren't supposed to be. The only sections of the salvage yard Rissa couldn't see from here was the building where fabric scrap was kept, cleaned, and prepped for resale, the furnaces, the small garden that fed the slaves, and Delilah's villa. Delilah owned the salvage yard and lived in the large, beautiful house on the far side. Even though she regularly mentioned how amazing of a deal she had gotten on it, because no one wanted to live next to the scrap yard, Rissa took private pleasure in the fact that Delilah hated living there. She wanted a house with a view of the sea, but couldn't afford one. She couldn't even afford a full contingent of servants and had to bring salvage yard slaves in to do the cleaning, laundry, and general housework on a rotating basis. Even though the work was easier than heavy manual labor in the yard, Rissa preferred the yard to housework. She preferred Delilah at a distance. Rissa took a moment to throw a rude gesture towards the house before she dropped down onto the street outside. The municipal street sweepers had already been at work for hours, and there was a pile of junk against the wall waiting for Delilah's slaves to haul in and sort in the morning. Rissa glanced through it, kicked a rat off a piece of silk that looked like something dead had been wrapped in it, but was otherwise quite pretty, and tucked the fabric in her shirt. Then she turned towards the market. The salvage yard and the sweepers kept the city pretty clean. The sweepers picked up anything left on the streets and brought it to the salvage yard to be dealt with. Rot, offal, and the truly unsalvageable was burned or used for compost in the garden. They cut wood into as big of pieces as possible. Delilah sold the biggest to carpenters, the middle to artists, and the smallest as firewood. Fabric was washed, large pieces were sold to seamstresses and dress shops, but anything smaller than a yard was shredded, bleached, and spun into yarn to be rewoven. Metal was separated into types, melted and poured into bars, then stored until Delilah could sell it. Stone usually sat the longest, and was usually bought by sculptors, though sometimes builders would buy pieces as a cheap option for projects where the stone didn't have to match. Considering her entire workforce were slaves, and Delilah didn't have to buy any of it, as long as she dealt with the city's garbage, she even got a commission on top of any profit from sales. The woman made a pretty damn good living. When Rissa got to the market, she walked past the vendors selling meat pies, ignoring her stomach growling at the tantalizing scent. She didn't have money for food until she sold the ribbons she had brought with her. The ribbons were made of bright, pretty fabric scraps, stolen by Rissa, Talia, and the others while they worked in the fabric house, and then woven together while they should be sleeping. Rissa had tried over the years to steal other, more profitable things, and had learned it wasn't worth it. Stealing fabric scraps usually earned her a couple of lashes. Last time she had been caught stealing something Delilah could have sold, a piece of fabric the size of her palm with a perfect embroidered rose in the center, Rissa had gotten 20 lashes and had been denied food for 3 days. Delilah had said Rissa didn't need food, since she could clearly feed herself with ill-gotten gains. Rissa had then earned herself an additional 10 lashes and another day without food by pointing out that she couldn't unless Delilah gave her back the embroidery. Rissa peeked into the shadowy shop through the open door, saw there was one last customer arguing the price of a cloak with the shopkeeper, and ducked back across the street to wait. The shopkeeper wouldn't buy anything from her if there was a witness to see that the beautiful, intricate ribbons that ornamented the veils, cloaks, and dresses were bought for pennies off a street rat. He sold those ribbons for a hell of a lot more than he bought them for, but Rissa didn't take offense. She couldn't sell the ribbons for more than he gave her, and if the shopkeeper didn't make money off of them, he wouldn't buy them. They both got what they needed from this arrangement. So she waited until the customer left, his new cloak folded over his arm, before she slipped into the shop. She stood in front of the counter, waiting for the man to finish whatever he was writing and notice her. After a few minutes, he looked up and jumped. "Oh, Rissa, I didn't hear you come in." She shrugged. That was obvious. "You have something for me?" She nodded, pulling a couple of dozen ribbons out of her shirt and handing them over. He pulled a lamp close, leaning in to examine the different ribbons. Sometimes he didn't like the color combinations or found flaws in the fabrics and wouldn't buy them. She would take those back, they would take them apart, and usually Talia would rework them into something he liked better. While he examined the ribbons in detail, he asked, "I haven't seen that boy, Timmons, in a few months. Is he all right?" "No." He glanced up at her, shook his head, and went back to the ribbons. Rissa turned back to watch out the door. Not for any particular reason. The guards would not come looking for her yet. "I can give you 25 pennies for these." The shopkeeper held up all but one ribbon, which he handed back to Rissa. "This one's got a stain that doesn't look like pattern." He pointed to a rust-colored splotch on the tail end of the section of blue silk, braided into a pattern of off-white. She tucked that one back in her shirt. Then she waited patiently while he counted the coins into her hand and turned to go. "Hey, Rissa, when can I expect more? I used to see you kids a couple of times a month." She shrugged again, trying to release the tightness in her shoulders. "Don't know. I'll talk to the others." Timmons had been the one that did the running for his team, and Bion, who did the running for the third team, hadn't been willing to sneak out since Timmons died. Outside of the shop, she headed for the food stalls, skirting around the delicious-smelling pies to a stall in the back that sold stew scraps. She bought 3 pork bones with a good amount of meat left on them, then crossed to the stall selling vegetables. Experience made her skip the almost rotten stuff. Though it was cheaper, it did them no good if it went bad in a day. She wrapped everything she bought in a piece of clean but stained linen, shoved it in her shirt, and headed back. She paused on her way past the Colosseum, listening to the cheering and staring up at the imposing walls. Then she took a deep breath and kept walking. She stood for a moment before the wall to the salvage yard as well, staring up at it. From the outside it looked rough, the walls dirtied by trash that was piled there every night. It smelled, and there was rubbish strewn about constantly, even after they put in hours cleaning each morning. While she stood there, one of the street sweepers dragged up a pile of cracked flower pots. He gave her a companionable nod and stumbled off. She shook her head, leapt up, caught the spot halfway up the wall where the plaster was entirely crumbled out, and flung herself up onto the top. At some point in the distant past, the walls had had ceramic shards cemented into them to cut anyone who tried to climb over, but through the years they had been broken away in patches. As long as someone knew where to go over, they were perfectly safe. Rissa paused at the top to take one last moment to enjoy the feeling of the air on her skin. Down in the yard, the air stagnated, the walls keeping the smells, heat, and dust inside. Even in winter, it seemed too hot inside those walls, even while bitingly cold. In summer, the place was sweltering. But it was spring. The air was cool, at least on top of the wall. Rissa dropped down into the dusty dirt below. She ignored the guard, who saw her and took a step her way. It was Tegan, and Tegan had been afraid of her for years. He wouldn't do anything without backup. Probably not even then, unless he had Delilah at his back. He was a problem for the morning. "Rissa's back!" Talia called out the second she stepped into the dorm, as if it had been days since they saw each other, not less than an hour. Rissa let Talia hug her, handed the supplies off to Cameron, who was in charge of the food, and threw herself down on the blankets. They would have stew in an hour or so, but it had been a long day. Rissa was asleep long before the food was ready.